Nazi concentration camps, in their essence, became a real gathering of psychopaths of the most terrible kind, who found use for their perverted fantasies, having in their undivided use thousands of powerless prisoners who had absolutely no rights. People of all stripes in a Nazi uniform could do whatever they wanted. Therefore, in addition to the usual conditions of detention for prisoners, which even with all assumptions could not be called minimally human, the guards also arranged for themselves additional entertainment, which even today makes the blood run cold. Abuse of little prisoners. The most terrible, of course, can be called the atrocities that the Nazis committed against young prisoners, who were purely physically unable not to perceive the situation in which they found themselves, to protect themselves in any way, and not at all to understand what was happening. When children began to cry from hunger, the Nazi guards, so as not to irritate them with tears, simply killed them. Other even more terrible entertainments were murders in front of mothers. The Nazis grabbed small children by the legs, spun them in the air and, with all their strength, hit their heads against a wall or table. Many mothers, from what they saw, died, went crazy or completely turned gray. It was the norm to drive the population into an area fenced with wire, take children away from their mothers, and right there, in front of the parents' eyes, take them by the legs and hit them against the corner of the house. Children who, during the march or in some free time, tried to steal something edible, were punished by guards, beaten with a whip or a baton. In one of the children's camps, many prisoners recalled an unidentified German woman, Frau Elisa, who arranged entertainment for herself out of the feeling of constant hunger for the children, as one of the former prisoners, Peter Fedorovich, recalled. This Frau used to come into the camp, there lying on a bunk somewhere, the commander Kinder says, you go with her, she starts to have fun. I remember what happened to me, here she stands, holds a mug of milk and gives it to me from a distance, teasing me, I'm walking hungry, and behind me a shepherd dog jumps over me, I somersault and didn't drink that milk. They said that the German woman was very amused, so much so that when one of the kids stretched out in front of the spilled milk, he was knocked down by the same shepherd. Frau Elsa graciously allowed the milk to come out of the ground. In another camp for women and children, the main entertainment of the guards was a siren, it could sound at any moment. After the siren started, the children had to run to their mothers and then quickly return back. If the child did not have time to return, then both he and his mother were shot. In one of the children's concentration camps in Belarus, the Nazis came up with an entertainment called sledding. When they got drunk, they gathered the strongest ones, harnessed them to a cart, and they themselves sat down and began to whip them so that they would run faster. At the same time, they often forced me to sing while running. If one of the children fell or stumbled, the drunken Nazis could beat him to death or shoot him on the spot. Another perhaps most terrible entertainment of the Nazis was a walk. In order to understand the essence, you need to know that, as a rule, children served as blood, plasma, and skin donors for wounded German soldiers and officers. Naturally, after numerous blood draws, the children quickly weakened and the moment came when the German executioners in white coats understood. It is impossible to take anything else from this child. But like any person, the children strived to survive and wanted to live. Therefore, they often asked their uncles and aunts of doctors not to send them to the gas chamber, to give them the opportunity to gain strength in order to still be useful. And very often uncles and aunts gave such permission, giving the doomed child the opportunity to go for a walk so that he could rest a little. But the walk was allowed in a strictly defined direction. For example, in the Salaspils concentration camp, it was outwardly a lawn overgrown with green grass, which, in fact, masked the crematorium oven, where the fire was constantly burning. As the child walked across this lawn, at some point he fell straight down into the roaring flames. This joke amused the executioners in white coats terribly. Entertainment on condemned and adult prisoners. As for adult prisoners, It is also almost impossible to list the number of sadistic entertainments of the Nazis. The most harmless thing was when the guards, having selected several people whom they did not like for some reason, gave commands to lie down and crawl. Moreover, the command had to be executed immediately. Otherwise, severe beatings to death or execution followed, and the prisoners fell and crawled. Sometimes on water, sometimes on broken glass, sometimes on manure or stones, and the guards standing nearby often had fun even filming what they saw. In the Koldichevo concentration camp, Baranovichi district of Belarus, prisoners sentenced to death before death were forced to perform a kind of ritual, which was very funny. For example, according to the memoirs of surviving prisoners Yara Makavich, on the famous Kolakevsky oak tree, on which at least 1,000 people were hanged, nooses were always ready. The person sentenced to death was forced to scream loudly throughout the day, for which he was sentenced to death. So Yara Makavich remembered a young man at the age of 16 who stood near an oak tree and shouted loudly, running away and catching up. When the young man no longer screamed, but began to barely whisper, he was beaten with batons until he again began to shout the same words loudly. When the guards had had enough fun, the unfortunate guy was hanged, and his body was not removed for the edification of others for several more days. Today famous and hundreds of other entertainments for Nazi guards and overseers. For example, about the hobbies of some people in making lampshades and leather goods, from tattooed and often plain leather, which were taken from prisoners. The specially famous Frau Lampshaded Elsa Cook was keen on this. Also, some Nazi craftsmen even started producing furniture from human bones in their free time. The well-known one of the most terrible executioners, Irma Grezi, for the sake of entertainment, deliberately did not feed her dogs for several days, and then set them on the prisoners, laughingly watching how hungry animals chewed the unfortunate prisoners alive. Maria Mondel, another Nazi female devil, specially organized an orchestra of female prisoners, which greeted new prisoners arriving at the camp with bravura music. Among the guards of the Jewish ghettos, one of the most popular pastimes was the so-called raids. Drunken Nazis entered the barracks, used flashlights to select the girls they liked, and often began to rape them on the spot. If it turned out that the girl was a virgin, then the guards invited other colleagues to see the new body so that they could get special pleasure. As for prisoners of war, the scope for abuse here was simply monstrous. According to official data, prisoners of war in concentration camps were not specifically fed for several days, and then they were transferred to the territory of dead animals. The Nazis were amused by this. Prisoners of war were often used for even more terrible entertainment, stripped down to their underwear, exhausted prisoners, and sent barefoot to run through a minefield. The Nazis placed bets, each on their own runner, who would win the competition by running the longest. Boxing and sports teams. On the one hand, this is monstrous entertainment, and on the other, strange as it may seem, it also became a symbol of the prisoners' resistance to the Nazis. Concentration camp guards, in order to hone their hand-to-hand combat skills, began selecting the strongest prisoners for so-called boxing matches. This entertainment gained such popularity that it was even approved by Hitler personally. The main idea of such fights was to demonstrate the superiority of the Aryans over non-Aryans, although for the sake of justice, even a victory over an exhausted and hungry prisoner could not be considered something outstanding. However, quite often professional Nazi boxers encountered professionals, wrestlers, boxers, and athletes who not only did not lose, but even defeated the guards. Later, the idea of duels was transformed by the Nazis. Tournaments were organized between prisoners of different teams, which the Nazis formed independently. Winning the fight meant life, losing the gas chamber. It should be noted that the guards provided their athletes with enhanced rations so that the prisoner could last the maximum possible number of fights. True, even victory did not guarantee life. Often the camp authorities, enraged by the athlete's invincibility, simply gave the order to destroy him. Actually, any entertainment with prisoners always contained the possibility of death, regardless of whether the guards were satisfied or not. Because a concentration camp, despite the type of labor or correctional camp, was originally intended only for one mass extermination of people.